What is up, everybody? We're back again. Corey Hughes, Bloody History. Today I said we're gonna mix it up, and we're gonna mix it up. So today we're gonna go over the Church Committee testimony of William Colby, director of the CIA, murdered by the CIA. Date May 23rd, 75. Interesting list of subjects here on the cover sheet. Subjects: document requests, Alan Dulles, Sheffield Edwards; executive action capability, FBI, Sam Giancana, William Harvey; Howard Hunt, Robert Kennedy; Edward Lansdale, Las Vegas; law enforcement wiretapping, Robert Mayhew; Operation Mongoose; organized crime, Fletcher Prouty, John Roselli, Frank Sturgis, Sam Travacante; Warren Commission, information withheld from ZR Rifle; Cuban exiles, conspiracy theories, three tramps, William Colby; clandestine operations, CIA, Church Committee, Scott Breckenridge, Richard Bissell; foreign leaders' assassinations. Also, anti-Castro activities, AMLASH, Rolando Cubella. This testimony is top secret. Date of last review, 8/10/93. Testimony: William Colby, Director, Central Intelligence Agency. Friday, May 23rd, 1975. U.S. Government Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Committee met pursuant to notice at 9:15. Room 407, Capitol Building. Senator Frank Church presiding. Present are Senators Church, Hart of Michigan, Mondale, Huddleston, Morgan, Hart of Colorado, Matthias, and Schweiker. Also present, William Miller, Staff Director, FAO; Schwartz, the third, Chief Counsel; Curtis R. Smothers, Minority Counsel; William Bader, Professional Staff Member. And they go ahead and they swear him in. He swears to tell the truth. And then it starts off with Mr. Church. I have answered a few of the questions that were raised at the meeting the other day, and there are a couple of clarifications I'd like to make. This is Director Colby. One with respect to the security investigations in the United States. The question was asked whether we ever used private investigators, and I said we normally use our own investigators. We have some relationships with private investigatory firms which provide cover for our investigators, and secondly, we have a few firms which we own, which are proprietary, if you will, whereby our investigators appear to be private. I said that in the past it's clear that on occasion we did ask for private investigator firms to help us to some degree. It was usually the one thing that was giving us cover, and for reasons of overload, we asked them to have their own people to do a few of the investigations. My general counsel says that this is illegal. I have a strong question about its propriety, if not legality, and I am undertaking to review this matter to see whether we cannot just eliminate that practice entirely, continuing the proprietary and continuing the use of private investigations as cover last time that there have been occasions on which this was done. Chairman Church, Mr. Colby, would you, in connection with your review of this matter, supply the committee with the specifics in those cases where the agency has in fact engaged private investigators to do agency work? I will certainly try to, Mr. Chairman. I confess this may be a tough job to locate every case, but I certainly will do my best. Will you provide the committee with the opinion of your counsel with respect to the legality of such? I will. Such use of private investigators? Yes. I then would ask the staff also to furnish the committee with a brief on that question so that we are fully advised with respect to the law. Right, said Mr. Colby. The second subject, Mr. Chairman, Senator Mondale, asked for our command and control regulations for the approval of covert actions projects. Those were supplied to the staff on the 1st of May and are available to the staff. Thirdly, I was asked if Mr. Harvey was removed from the agency because of his involvement in the assassination plans against Prime Minister Castro. The facts are that in June of 63, he was assigned as our chief of station in Rome, and in February of 67, he was reassigned to CIA headquarters. He retired voluntarily under our retirement system on 31 December 1967. If I may, there is a reason why he was taken out, and if I could go off the record and mention that to the committee, it's a matter of his privacy. Very well off the record. All right, then they're back on the record. Senator Schweiker asked me whether Howard Hunt or James McCord were in charge of Mexican operations at the time of President Kennedy's assassination on the 22nd November 63. Howard Hunt, from July 62 to August 64, was assigned as a section chief in the Division of Plans Directorate, which is now the Operations Directorate at CIA headquarters, which had no responsibility whatsoever for Mexican operations. Senator Schweiker then asks, what were those dates again? Colby says, July 62 to August of 64. Senator Schweiker says, wasn't he at some point in Mexico City and in charge of that office? Mr. Nosh then says, Knoche, way back in the 1950s, he served in Mexico City. Way back. He was not in charge. Senator Schweiker then says, so that's the period you're saying he had no jurisdiction in any way with Latin America or Mexican affairs. Colby says, no, he was in what we call, and what we have since changed the name, the Domestic Operations Division at the time, our operations here in this country. And that's a whole different subject I would have to explain someday. Mr. McCord, from June 62 to June 64, was assigned as a CIA officer in the CIA station at Frankfurt, Germany, and he had no responsibility for Mexican operations at that point. Senator Morgan, last time we asked what information was given to the Warren Commission concerning agency assassination plans concerning Castro, and I've been advised our records do not indicate the Warren Commission was provided with information on this subject. Alan Dulles, of course, I would note, who was the CIA director until the fall of 61, was a member of the Warren Commission, but beyond that fact, I have nothing I could offer. And then who made the decision not to provide it if none was given? Our records do not indicate that there was a CIA decision on this matter not to tell the Warren Commission. I could add that I believe that the relationship with the Warren Commission was handled by one of our staffs, which I cannot say that for sure, but I know the compartmentation system was such. Senator Church then says, what was the name of the CIA agent who was given the responsibility for liaison between the CIA and the Warren Commission? To my knowledge, it is Mr. Raymond Roca, R-O-C-C-A. Aha, so there's that name, Raymond Roca, again. And again, it was brought to my attention, I believe by Ergo or Jim, that there are two Raymond Rocas in the CIA, not to be confused with each other. Or are there? Mr. Raymond Roca was who was a good friend of, Jesus Christ, of David Morales. The fix was in the whole time. There was no chance of any information getting through. Chairman Churchton says, where is it now? Colby says he retired at the end of December last year. He remained working for us for a few months. I think he's retired. I believe he's still in the Washington area. Mr. Nosh then says, yes, he's still working with us. Colby then says, still working with us to help on the transition of the whole counterintelligence program. Church asks, why did he retire? Colby then says, that was the Angleton case, Mr. Chairman, and the facts of that case were that I had some professional differences in the organization with Mr. Angleton as to the way the counterintelligence business was run and the way that Israeli account was handled. I believe that it required a higher degree of coordination of the other elements of the directorate of the agency. We had debated this on various occasions in the past. That's wild. I got to screenshot this. He didn't ask him about Israel, but he's given him information about Israel. I believe that it required a higher degree of coordination of the other elements of the directorate of the agency. We had debated this on various occasions in the past. I did reorganize that staff in 73 and took a number of functions away from it. The liaison with the endeavor to be open up to the Israeli account to a better relationship with our other Near Eastern activities. We debated this over many months and on several occasions. We could never really agree to it because he insisted on the importance of retaining it where it was. Mr. Angleton had done a very good job of establishing that liaison years ago and knew a lot of the senior Israeli who were involved in it. I believe there was inadequate coordination in the Arab areas. Also, I believe that there... Sorry, I'm screenshotting it as I'm going because this is pretty important stuff. As I believe that there was a undue degree of compartmentation of that staff, that it needed more interchange with the other divisions. We debated this and discussed it, and I set as my time limit for this discussion the end of December because there were some very substantial retirement benefits that people would lose if they stayed after that point. Then, unfortunately, the Seymour Hersh article of December 22nd came to our attention before it was actually published. And so I brought Mr. Angleton up and said that I was going to make two basic decisions. I was going to move the Israeli account from his control, and I was going to put some successor leadership into the head of the counterintelligence staff. I said I would offer him a post of tying together some counterintelligence doctrine. He could stay working with us. He did not have to choose to retire. I insisted that I talk to him before the Seymour Hersh article appeared. I knew it was coming. I didn't know what it was going to say. I wanted to make clear between him and me that the decision was based upon our long-standing discussion of how to run that particular activity. Very interesting, wouldn't you say? The question then came up, who would be his successor, and Mr. Roca was his deputy. There were two other officers who were possibilities. One of the officers, Mr. Hood, had said in early December that he planned to retire at the end of December. The other two, Mr. Roca and Mr. Miller, were informed that they would not be the successor chief of that staff. They were offered a chance to stay on in their then current jobs. They chose to retire. All four of them agreed to stay with us on as a consultant basis over the next several months to help us on the transition of new leadership into that job, and they have done so. Senator Churchton says, well, without getting off the track, I just have one further question here in connection with Mr. Angleton himself. Is it true that he's still being paid as a consultant? Colby says, I believe it has dropped off, Mr. Chairman. He did help us for 3 or 4 months, but I believe that it was terminated. It is about time to terminate it, I know, and whether it is on this particular date has been terminated. Oh, page 10 omitted. So the next page is completely omitted. So they start talking about Angleton and whether or not he's still on the books or not, and then the next page gets omitted. It says misnumbered in the transcripts, but I don't buy that shit. The next one is back to Senator Church. He says there's no plan to retain him indefinitely. Colby says absolutely not. It was to help us get over this transition and phase him out. Church says very well. Senator Mondale then says, I asked for vouchers on payments with respect to assassinations. Colby says, I'm looking for that. I don't have answers for you yet, Senator. The request was also made whether we had any information concerning plots to assassinate Chu and Lai. We have reports of 2 such incidents, both conducted by the Chinese nationalists without our prior knowledge and without our participation. One in April of 1955, an Air India aircraft crashed at sea off of Indochina after departing from Hong Kong. Several Chinese communist delegates for the Bandung conference were on board, and it had been rumored that Chow En-lai would be on the aircraft. On the 11th of January, 1956, the British Colonial Office in London issued an official statement reporting that they had evidence that the Chinese nationalists had bribed a Hong Kong airport employee to place a bomb on the airplane. Wait a minute, it looks like I'm missing another page here. No, I'm not missing a page, but there's something wrong here. The something and the U.S. for sabotaging the aircraft. It must be the Chinese blame the British and the U.S. for sabotaging the aircraft. It's the only thing that would make sense. The aircraft employee had to flee to Taiwan. We had nothing to do with that incident and, frankly, heard about it after it occurred. Whenever the CIA says they had nothing to do with that incident, I just don't fucking believe it. In the fall of 1956, a senior Chinese nationalist official informed an officer of CIA that a Chinese national planned to assassinate Chow En-lai during his visit to Cambodia in November of 1956 and had been thwarted by the Cambodian arrest of the Chinese nationalist officer sent to Phnom Penh to supervise the attempt. We learned of this after it had happened, and we had nothing to do with it. We had a relationship with the Chinese Nationalist Intelligence Service over the years, and they clearly have done things without our knowledge or involvement. And in a number of areas, we've also worked together on some areas. These are 2 that were separate. Also, I was asked to look at the photographs of Howard Hunt and Sturgis that appeared in Newsweek some years ago. We obtained this photograph from the FBI last night about 5 o'clock. We had not had it before. We had a copy of the Newsweek edition. These are photographs of Howard Hunt in 49 and 50 and 61. This is the only photograph we have of Mr. Sturgis. It is taken out of the Newsweek. We've had no connection with Mr. Sturgis, and so we have had something photographs, so it is subject to the problems of it. We had our photographic experts and analysts and so forth look at these two individuals here who were picked up. We examined them in considerable detail and talking about the 61 Hunt photograph, comparing it with this, and this is the photograph, Newsweek photograph. You will see that there is a lot of sort of fundamental differences in the kinds of appearances they have, different characteristics of the individuals. With respect to Sturgis, of course, we are not as confident because we don't have as good a base to work from in our comparison, but at the same time, we see differences there also. Now we further looked, had one of our disguise people. We obviously had people who can disguise you. The red wig episode. It wasn't red, they insist. It wasn't ill-fitting. That's the thing that they get upset about. But they say that it would not be feasible to have them actually in a disguise, have these individuals actually in this disguise, and that it is too big a jump. It differs. Senator Huddleston then asks, how about the size of the individual? Are they pretty close? These two are. He looks like a shorter man from the surroundings, and Hunt is about medium height rather than this short. Mr. Nosh then says, Hunt is 5 feet 10.5 inches. Something, and analysis. And they really were able to do a pretty good job on Hunt. And what they do is identify certain key points, make measurements, and put adjustments, the same thing we do for the satellite photography in terms of these measurements and things like that, and compare it in that sense. And their conclusion is that is clearly this is not Hunt. They are absolutely confident that this photograph is not Hunt. They are less confident that it is not Sturgis because of the base on which they are operating, but they think it is not. Okay, so they're correct. It's not Hunt. It's definitely not Sturgis. It's Leo Masseri and Danny Green. Boom, boom. That is all in my book. Y'all should know that by now. That's like the basics, right? I think we've done a couple shows on the Three Tramps. I don't really feel like doing another one anytime soon. I don't really like talking about the Tramps too much. They're kind of, well, they're definitely relevant, but they're, to me, they're just a side story. Going back to the Cleveland mob, which leads you back to Chicago, right? But it leads you and connects you to Vincent Caltagirone Jr., the real Raoul, right? So we'll have to do some, man, I got to get to fucking Martin Luther King one of these days. I'm telling you, Jack Valenti was the shooter of Martin Luther King. I can't prove it yet, but I'm going to. All right, let me continue. I point out that this analysis was done overnight, about 3 o'clock in the morning. This is Sturgis. And to the right, hold on, who said this? Mr. Nosh said this, K-N-O-C-H-E. No, it's not Sturgis. The person they think is Sturgis is Danny Green. Without question. Without question. Mr. Schwartz says, and to the right, this is a newspaper photograph of Hunt, a recent one. These are sort of agency photographs of him when he was an employee. Senator Hart of Colorado then asks, were those men ever identified by the Dallas police? They must have booked them or something if they carried them in. I really don't know. If they took them in, I would assume they would have had to have booked them. Senator Hart says, what are these pictures on the lower right and left? These are blow-ups of the particular photographs. And then I can't read the next thing. It's cut, and it says, not the one you had earlier. Colby says they are different. Senator Hart of Colorado then says they are different angles. Colby says this is reversed. Hart then asks, they are different photographs. And he says it's reversed. Hart then says, no, they are not. A and B, even reversed. Colby then says they can do that kind of a turn through the... Senator Hart then says they can twist the photographs around. Colby says then they can make it appear at a different angle. Senator Hart of Colorado then says B, at least, is totally different pose. They turned his mouth down. His eyes are closed. They have really done a job if they changed B to that lower right. Wow. This to me seems to indicate that there's some acknowledgement that the photographs of the Tramps have been tampered with. Unless I'm crazy. Go back and re-listen to that and tell me if I'm crazy. I'll reread it from this statement here. Senator Hart of Colorado says, no, they are not A and B, even reserved. Colby says they can do that kind of a turn through the, and then it cuts off and it goes back to Hart. He says they can twist the photographs around. Colby then says they can make it appear at a different angle. So Colby is saying the CIA can make a photograph appear at a different angle. Hart then says B, at least, is totally different pose. They turned his mouth down. His eyes are closed. Have they really done a job if they changed B to that lower right? Interesting. Colby then says they can change them. Honest. Let me get my brief on that and I will answer that question. They magnified them to the same scale using the eyes and mouth. The contrast and texture differences were minimized. Continuous tone photographs employed and angular compensations were made to offset error incidents to the different heads. They can mix them around in that sort of fashion. That is fucking like, what? This is some pretty holy shit kind of stuff. Senator Schweiker then says, were these men detained? If they were detained, maybe there are photographs from their detention. Were these men arrested? Colby says, at the time, we've had to work on this. We've had to just look at the photographs. Schweiker says, I assume that is where they are going to be detained. Schwartz then says, wasn't the same analysis done for the Rockefeller Commission about 2 months ago? In other words, there's been an analysis at least once before last night, hasn't there? Mr. Nosh then says, not by us. Colby then says, perhaps by someone else. Senator Church says, Mr. Director, that's a different photograph. Colby says, it does look like it. I will answer that question next time I come up. So let me pause right here for a second. That's pretty, I'm going to just be like, holy shit. Colby himself here admitted that they can tamper with it, that they were tampering with photographs. And they have the ability to do so. And I screenshotted the stuff. I'm going to throw it into the JFK research chat, which if you're not in, you're fucking a loser. For real. Get in the JFK research chat. What's your problem? The JFK supporter chat. All right. Senator Church says, all right, how can we follow up on the identity of these two people in connection with the Dallas police? Would that be done through the FBI? Colby says FBI. I could ask, or you could ask. It might be better if you ask. Senator Church says, well, I think we should. I think these should be marked as committee exhibits, and staff should be instructed to follow through with the FBI to get what further information there may be about the photographs and these two supposed, these two, and I can't read it, it's all cut. And then it says, did you get the other photograph, the supposed Oswald photograph leaving the embassy? Colby says, I don't have that with me. It is in the Warren Commission published report. It is in there. Schweiker says it's in there. Colby says, yes. It was cropped slightly in order to conceal where it was taken, but it was. Schweiker says it's in the Warren Commission. Colby says, yes, it's in the Warren Commission. Just one additional matter. Senator Church says, just one thing I would like to say to you, Mr. Colby, before I forget it. You've made reference to the Israeli account and the special way that it had been handled under Mr. Angleton. Before we finish our review with you of covert operations, we would like to have a more detailed statement on that matter. Colby says, right. Church says, and I think you should prepare to discuss it with us, and we shall have further questions to ask you in connection with it. I just wanted to give you notice. Colby says, right, in our lexicon, it doesn't count as a covert action, but that is all right, no problem. I will cover it. Church says, all right, at some point then in our investigation. And Colby says, sure, no problem. The only other one thing I would like to suggest for the record, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the discussion of the attempts made by against Mr. Castro, in no way justifying them. My position on this is quite clear. I do think it important to put that exercise in the context of the times, which was the times of the Bay of Pigs, which was a decision made by the government. The Cuban Missile Crisis, and follow that, a program approved by our normal covert action approval mechanism to try to generate an overthrow of Mr. Castro from within by assisting various groups to go in with sabotage and putting economic pressure on the country and so forth. That went on for a number of years after the 61 to 62 episodes, and I think it does put a cover of policy attitude towards Cuba and towards Mr. Castro that is an important factor in evaluating the thing without in any way justifying the particular attempts to assassinate him. Senator Hart of Michigan then says, but was there any evaluation done at or about the time of that Cuban Missile Crisis? Colby says there was an evaluation done after the Bay of Pigs, a rather intensive investigation, internal security branch review of the activity, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis came along shortly thereafter before anything very much got going. Thereafter, however, a number of programs were conducted, which I am sure the committee might want a general summary of. I am just giving you one sort of a paragraph summary of it, which were aimed at putting economic pressure on Cuba in the hopes that this would put pressure against him and lead to its disorder and problems there. And secondly, to encourage revolutions, sabotage, and so forth from within Cuba through a variety of programs of propaganda, support of exile movements, landing of teams on the coast, things of this nature. Senator Churchton says the difficulty with this is, as I see it, although what you say is true, once an agency begins to engage in assassination attempts, the disease spreads. Your own testimony shows it's spread at least as far as the Dominican Republic, and we're going to get into closer questions on other matters such as Lumumba and Chile. So that I don't think the issue can be confined really to the emergency that did in fact exist between the U.S. and Cuba and the seriousness of that emergency at the time. Colby then says, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I'm against it and have been against it for a long time. But nonetheless, I think in fairness to the people involved at the period, I think it's important to give total context. Church says yes. Mr. Swartz then says something that appears to be redacted, and then the first part's cut off, and then it picks up at the CIA might have contemplated additional efforts to assassinate Castro. After the Bay of Pigs, after the missile crisis, it would not have acted unless directed by the very highest authority, would it? Colby then says, that's not clear, Senator Hart. I think the evidence we have is that the then director was not aware of some of these activities, and therefore one would have a very difficult time saying that it was pursuant to a specific authorization. It was consistent with an overall policy, which was the point I was saying, but nonetheless, I think the specific action we cannot say was approved even within the agency at the director level. All right, so what's going on here? What he's saying here is that, sorry, Mr. Church, but back in the days of Dulles and these guys, they kind of just did what the fuck they wanted, and nobody really had any accountability, and they pretended not to know shit, and that's basically what he's saying in not so many words. We cannot say was approved even within the agency at the director level, so even the director was in on it is basically what he's saying. Senator Hart of Michigan then says, is there any indication that the director, who did know of at least an earlier attempt, is there any indication that following the Bay of Pigs or following the missile crisis, he explicitly brought the subject up for review? There's one documentary evidence that Mr. McCone dictated in 1967, I believe it was, in which he recounted being informed of a meeting, of an interagency meeting, at which the subject of assassination was raised. And he made a particular point of indicating after the meeting, he was not at the meeting, I believe, but he heard of the meeting, and he made a particular point of saying he disapproved of this and did not, blah, 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 can't read it, something, the other members. Who was at that meeting McCone heard about? That was the meeting we were talking about at the last session. You brought up a new document, which was Mr. McCone's dictation of recollection of 1967. Yes, I think you have that. I have not seen. That I have not seen. I know we do not have that. Colby says, I'm sorry, I thought you did. Could that be supplied? No problems, yes. This is our document, and Church cuts him off. Will you supply the committee with the document? Mr. Colby then says, yes. Excuse me, I beg your pardon. He states in 1967 at one of these meetings about this time, I recall a suggestion being made to liquidate top people in the Castro regime, including Castro. I took immediate exception to the suggestion, stating that the subject was completely out of bounds as far as the U.S. government and CIA were concerned. The idea should not be discussed, nor should it appear in any papers. Mondale then says, Mr. Colby, the other day when you testified, there was a memorandum that you gave us from, I think, Mr. Osborne, which objected to a memorandum by General Lansdale, which referred to assassinations of political leaders in a memorandum regarding Operation Mongoose, which was Cuba. And it referred to an attached memorandum, which I think you said was the property of the FBI. Of the National Security Council, Mondale says, NSC. I gather you have a copy of that, but you don't feel authorized to let us see it. Colby says, I do have a copy of it. The understanding we have had with the other agencies is that each of us gives our own material, but we refer to the other agency for any documents belonging to the other agency. Chairman Church says, well, it's very difficult for the committee to operate that way. I think that since the committee is entitled to this information, that when it is pertinent and as we proceed in our hearings from one subject to another, we ought to be able to secure the information without having to go back through executive channels. Colby says, may I undertake to get the permission to give it to you? I will undertake to do this today. Just a reminder, people, Mr. Colby is the head of the fucking CIA. So who's he got to go get permission from? If you're the head of the CIA and you got to get permission, you ain't the head of the CIA. Church then says, any observations that the committee wishes to make on this kind of problem? It is the first time that this has come up. So he's wondering if anyone else in the committee has a problem with the fact that Colby won't give up the documents. Can't read the rest of this and says, is this the understanding we have had or not? I guess he's confronting him on the why can't we have the document? Mr. Schwartz then says it has been a total frustration to the staff, and I'm very happy to come up here because we get chased around the corner by one agency to another. It is called the third agency rule. It was intended to have nothing to do with congressional hearings. Obviously, it had to do with declassification to the public, and it's happened to be completely delay our ability to get information because we go to one agency and then they determine that it really isn't their document or it mentions some other agency, and then we have to go to the other agency. This is an example of how frustrating it is. Mondale says, have we tried to get this document from the NSA? That's the National Security Administration. Mr. Colby says, no, this particular document just came up on Wednesday. Schweiker says, does the council have any suggestions as to what he feels the committee position should be on this area to enable him and staff to do an effective job? Schwartz says, I think the committee's position ought to be that pertinent information should be produced by any agency that possesses it. And if they wish to inform another agency that they are doing it, then that is their business. But I think they should have to produce it if they possess it. Can't read this part and says, this memo from McCone refers back to the meeting about which the Osborne memorandum and the Lansdale, and it cuts off. Colby then says, the series of 2 or 3 meetings at that time, yes. Mondale says, I think this is very important because it's apparently this was a meeting at which McNamara and Rusk were present, and apparently McCone was present. So we had all the top principals. Colby says, at least one of them. Mondale says, and they discussed assassinations at that meeting, and then Osborne came back with a memo which is now part of that record. Colby says, I think it's Edwards in that case. Harvey, excuse me. Senator Mondale, Harvey, he came back with a memo which the director supplied, objecting not to the assassination, but putting it in writing. He's talking about William Harvey, Bill Harvey, who was the head of the ZR rifle program. Chairman Church then says, of course, what we don't know is whether the assassination or subject of assassination that came up at this meeting was conjecture, or whether it had to do with a revelation of actual attempts that involved the CIA, or that it had to do with an ongoing assassination effort by the CIA. Mondale says, yes. Church says, all we know is the subject of assassinations apparently came up in the course of the meeting. Colby replies, Mr. Chairman, as one of the agencies involved, if I could offer one explanation for the third agency rule, even in this circumstance. And I'm particularly interested in this because sometimes our documents have material whose sensitivity is not apparent on the face, and we assume that this will be handled in certain compartmented channels. And if it gets out of the compartment, it might give problems that the individual at the other end wasn't aware of. That is the basis for the rule. The thought being, go back and ask the originator, and he has a feeling for that and could make the particular case if something particularly sensitive is involved. Church says, I would suggest, Mr. Colby, without binding the committee to a precedent with respect to dealing with a third-party rule, that in this case you undertake to secure from the NSA. Colby says, I will. Church says it's permission to turn that particular document over to the committee so it may be made part of these hearings. Colby says, I will endeavor to do that today, Mr. Chairman. Senator Morgan then says, I am going to inquire from Senator Mondale what memorandum you were reading about McCone and the group being present. It is right here from Mr. Harvey. Do I have the wrong one? Yes, it is dated. I will show it to you, in which he objects to it. Senator Churchton says, what's the date of it? Mondale says the 14th of August, 62. Morgan says, do we have it? Schwartz says, it was shown to us Wednesday, marked or deemed marked as part of the record, and returned to the CIA, who returned it to us today. Colby says, I have another copy. Mondale says it refers to a meeting in Rusk's office at which presumably McNamara and Rusk, I gather from the later memo, and McCone were present, and it says this. I called Lansdale's office and in his absence pointed out to Frank Head the inadmissibility and stupidity of putting this type of comment in writing in a document. The words he objected to were including liquidation of leaders. I advised him as far as CIA was concerned, he would write no document pertaining to this and would participate in no open meeting to discuss it. I read that to mean we will go ahead and do it, but we don't want anything in writing, and we don't want to be in a meeting where it is going to leak. That makes a lot of sense. No living politician wants to be associated with an assassination ever. If he wants something, I think it's common sense. That's why I think these documents are so crucial. Church says, of course they're crucial. We must have them. The ambiguity, however, that we've yet to clear up is the third paragraph, Senator Mondale, where the memorandum reads the question of assassination, particularly of Fidel Castro, was brought up by Secretary McNamara at the meeting of the special group augmented in Secretary Rusk's office in August. It was the obvious consensus at the meeting in answer to a comment by Mr. Ed Murrow that this is not a subject which has been made a matter of official record, the subject being the question of assassination. Now, that leaves us still without any documentary proof that it was revealed at this meeting that the CIA was in fact engaged in an effort to assassinate. All right, so let me pause and see if I can't fucking interpret this. So what's going on here is he sees that McNamara brings up in this meeting the notion of assassination. But at this point in time, there's no evidence whatsoever that anyone's ever talked about assassination, particularly not any meetings between CIA personnel and White House personnel, nor Army personnel in General McNamara, or Secretary McNamara. And so what you've got here are people who know things and bring things up at a time when they shouldn't know things and shouldn't be bringing things up. So what they're asking here without asking it is, what the fuck? Why do these people all of a sudden seem to know about assassination, and it doesn't seem like the CIA ever brought it up to them? Are they just fucking psychics? So let me continue. Mondale says, was Lansdale working for the CIA at the time? Colby says, pardon. Mondale says, was General Lansdale working for the CIA at this time? Colby then says, General Lansdale was assistant to the Secretary of Defense, not CIA, at that time. Mondale says, has Lansdale been with the CIA? Colby says, he was with CIA in about 1952 to about 1955, more or less. Okay, so remember, once CIA, always CIA. Mondale says, during the Philippines. Colby then says, during the Philippines and in Vietnam at that time. Then he left CIA. He was a regular Air Force officer all this time, but he was assigned to CIA for the time he was in the Philippines and the time he was in Vietnam. He then reverted to the Air Force and was an assistant to the Secretary of Defense until about 64 or 65. Then he went out to Vietnam, where he was an assistant to the ambassador, not working for CIA. We were associated with him, but he was not a CIA officer at the time. Okay. I have to screenshot that because basically what he's saying is, yeah, he was CIA. Okay. And so this is a great example of how we have people who are generals in the fucking army, right? Joint Chiefs of Staff and shit, who are owned by the CIA. That's clearly what happened. And Mondale knows it, right? Mondale knows it. That's why he's pressing him on the questioning. Mondale says, do we know what his job at the Pentagon was? Colby says it was assistant to the Secretary of Defense. I can't tell you exactly what the job entitled, but he was active in the Secretary of Defense's participation in a variety. You might call it a 40 committee type of operation. I think he probably was the most cognizant of the various 40 committee. Mondale says if he were involved with that, he would have close liaison with all the members of the 40 committee, including CIA. Colby says, yes, sir. Church says, I would like to call your attention also to this sentence. I took careful notes on the comments at this meeting on this point, and at the special group augmented in not expecting any written comments or study on this point. There again, the ambiguity. It is within the range of possible that one of the ongoing efforts of the CIA was in fact raised and discussed. It's also possible that the question of assassinating Fidel Castro, Mondale says, do we have these notes? And Church says, I was going to ask that. and that it was agreed that no study or review of this should be submitted as an abstract matter, should be submitted in written form. So we are left without an answer to this question. However, with respect to the notes that are referred to here, can you tell us whether those notes exist? Colby says, I don't know of any, Mr. Chairman. Church says he took careful notes. Colby says, I don't know of any, but I'll certainly look. Scott Breckenridge then says, when we received this problem in 1967, we found no such notes. Senator Huddleston then says, let me inject a thought or two along this line. It seems to me like one of the things we are going to have to determine as we go along is as to what extent there was or there something can't read it, something procedure of your agency, an effort not to make notes, an effort for certain individuals not to have certain knowledge by design. For instance, I was reading your memorandum here dated 1 June 73, in which you're reporting on a meeting that occurred. You make a point to say that you briefed someone orally. The word orally is in there, assuming that for the purpose someone should know that you did not put anything in writing, or you did not give him a written report. You also say that I personally managed to avoid gaining any knowledge of what precise actions were taken. I think a reasonable inference there is that there is a deliberate on your part here, and maybe this is standard operating procedure, for you to not get specific information so that you will always be in the position of not knowing something. Colby says, I don't recognize the reference. Certainly, I think in past years there were situations we did not want to commit to writing. There was a great deal of effort made by us to what we call compartment information so that it is known only to certain people and not known to others. The compartment is still to be open at the top, however. There are things that I purposely try not to know. I don't want to know the name of an agent in the Soviet Union. I have absolutely no desire to learn his name because I don't need to know that information. Senator Huddleston then says, here we are referring to action in this case and not individuals. Colby says, I don't recognize that. I could perhaps put it in context if I could see this memorandum. Schwartz says perhaps we ought to mark that memorandum. Huddleston says memorandum for Mr. William E. Colby. I thought it was Mr. Colby. I thought it was by Mr. Colby. Colby then says, I'm sorry. Huddleston says someone within the agency apparently is informing you about something, and the subject is special activities. I don't see a name on it. It has information in it about both the president and attorney general being involved in briefings. Schwartz says, I think for convenience or reference, we ought to mark it as an exhibit. Let's number as today's number, and we have put in the 3 charts so far, and we will call this, which is the June 73 memorandum for William Colby, subject special activities, stamped from pages 457, 58, and 59 of the so-called 694 pages. The document above referred to was marked as Colby Exhibit number 4. Jim, can we see if we can't find Colby Exhibit number 4, all 694 pages of it? The something to William E. Colby is addressed to William E. Colby as we were going through that period in the middle of 1973 where I was technically, I guess, director of operations, but had been nominated to become director. This was the kind of thing that normally would be addressed to the director, but we had an acting director, General Walters, but it was pretty clear I was responsible for making the machinery run, and we had a lot of things around the agency addressed to me and signed by me. I believe this follows a conversation I had with Mr. Walter Elder, who was an assistant to Mr. John McCone. He was executive assistant when he was director. I think Mr. Elder told me that there were certain things that he knew of in the background that related to this effort of identifying various questionable activities of the agency, and I asked him to go write them down so we could get them into the Inspector General's report. Huddleston says the only question I raise, I don't want to get off the contents of the particular memorandum, but the context with the area you are pursuing, just whether or not standard operating procedure would require at times there would be a deliberate avoidance by certain people in the agency of facts, and whether or not there is a great body of decisions that are made and implemented without anything written down so that there would never be any documentary evidence of it. And then I can't really read that. And says, well, you can certainly say that there is an avoidance by a lot of people of learning things that they are not authorized to know. I mean, the more loyal, in a sense, of our employees say that they have authority to know what is going on in, say, Cuba. They don't have a right to know what's going on in, say, China. And they rather carefully keep themselves from learning what is going on in China. I think that is a prevalence. I think the question you're asking, however, is whether we are trying to keep activities off of paper, and it is pretty clear that the assassination story was essentially kept off the paper. And I would think that is about the only one. No, the drug thing, I assume that some of that was kept off the paper. Breckenridge says yes. Colby says the lesson that I have frequently given to my colleagues in the bureaucracy is that however hard you try to keep it off of paper, you will not succeed in a bureaucracy. Somebody will write it down, and therefore it is totally feckless exercise to pretend that you can keep it secret by not writing it down. But the fact is there were situations in which a conscious effort was made in the past to keep things off the record. Senator Huddleston then says, to sum it up, you as director, with the exception of individual names, for which there would be no particular value to you and no advantage to you knowing, except for that you make no deliberate effort not to know about the operations. Colby says, no, as a matter of fact, I take the opposite position, Senator. I say that to my subordinates and have reiterated a number of times, I cannot be subjugated to surprise. You have got to let me know the things I ought to know. And I have undertaken the same obligations to my oversight committees, for example, that I am responsible getting to them before they hear about it someplace else. Huddleston then says the other is in this inquiry. Can the committee expect that every effort will be made to supply to us information about various things, even though they may not be written down? Colby says, you have my commitment to that effect. Huddleston says, going further and looking through the files for notes and documents, it is my hope, Senator, that I can help you in this investigation rather than defending myself against you. Huddleston says that is all. Colby says that is what I would like to have the relationship. I'm trying to help you do this investigation. Church says we want such a relationship and we are trying to work it out. Colby says, I know you do. You have said it a number of times and I appreciate that. Church says, now, Senator Mondale, the memorandum from John McCone that we received this morning, dated April 14, 1967, is addressed to the director. Was McCone an employee or related with the CIA at that time? No, he left in 1965. Mondale asks, so this was a memorandum from a person no longer with the CIA as former director to the current director, which begins, no memorandum can be located covering the August 62 meeting. That is the one that earlier says the question of assassination was discussed. However, it is highly probable that one exists. Jim, that meeting was in August of 62 for the note. Now I would like all documentation, records, and notes that bear on the question of what McCone was referring to, because I get the impression that the then director, Mr. Helms, Colby says yes, Mondale says, was reviewing the question of documentations and records affecting that meeting, or the question of assassination. And I think we need to know what transpired, what was happening then, what kind of responses he received. Colby said, we will certainly give you that. I can give you a basic explanation. Something, the revelation in Jack Anderson's columns, the columnist, I believe, of our relationship with the mafia figures at that time. This has then generated the request to Mr. Breckenridge to do an Inspector General's report of this whole subject, which he did, and which we will certainly make available to this committee. In the course of it, and with the publicity, Mr. McCone, who does maintain an occasional contact with the agency, he's a friend of it and ex-director. I see him every now and again and try to sort of keep up with him, what's going on in general terms without getting into political or sensitive matters or anything. But he does maintain this contact, and I'm sure that somebody made contact with him, or he made contact with the agency about the Jack Anderson column, and that then generated this particular memorandum. Mondale then asks, and there was an Inspector General's study done at that time. Yes, sir, and you'll get access to that. Can we have some documentation as to how it was originated and the response it was done? Chairman Church then says, yes, we should have the information, and I might say that you are aware, no doubt, that charges have been made that documents have been destroyed in the CIA, which may have been connected with the general subject of CIA involvement in assassination efforts. Can you tell this committee whether or not your knowledge documents have been destroyed? Mr. Breckenridge then says, I think we can talk in terms of what we know is there. On the Castro assassination, the involvement with the mafia, there were a few memoranda in the Office of Security, and I think you have copies of those. On the second phase of that, there were practically no records at all, and our investigation at that time was made entirely on interviews, based entirely on interviews and attempts to reconstruct that activity. The final action, which involved a Cuban by the name of Cubella. Colby then says this was the Cuban major we discussed last time. Mr. Breckenridge then says, started in the minds of people who were involved, was an attempt to generate an internal political action, revolt, and the records are very full because there was no attention on the part of the people who were involved at that time. That would be an assassination in the sense that the original work with the mafia was engaged in, and there was full record, and that exists today. In the case of the Dominican Republic, this developed later. Let me finish. I will go back to the Cubella case. In the instance of the Dominican Republic, the record was very full then, and it is still very full today. I'm certain that the record is complete. Again, in the minds of the people who were involved, they drew a line between the support they gave to the coup group and conscious association with assassination as such. Those records are complete, and those records were developed at the time that they were retained. It was in the period of the mafia that the mafia was involved, where people knew the purpose was assassination. The records are practically non-existent, and I believe they never existed. Harvey, who conducted the second phase of that at the time of our investigation, had a handful of cryptic notes that only he could interpret. We couldn't interpret them, and it is my understanding that those notes no longer exist. They were retained by him, and he brought them in at the time that we were questioning him. He was then on sick leave prior to retirement. Those notes were totally unrevealing. I think that those records are in the same state today that they were taken then. There were none in the Castro affair except the results of our investigation involving the mafia. The Cubella case is full. That case did progress to the point that on the very day of President Kennedy's assassination, a man was meeting with Cubella in Paris, and in response to Cubella's request, offered him an assassination device that at the time of the investigation we understood he accepted, but I have since been told he did not accept. It was a ballpoint pen converted into a syringe for injecting poison. Subsequently, arms were handled to Cubella by a Cuban refugee in Madrid in the very early part of 1965, and 2 catches were put down by boats off Cuba for Cubella. I think he may have recovered one of those, but not the other. The records on that are pretty complete. So generally speaking, on those things where the agency was involved, with the exception of the association with the mafia, where from the beginning the intent was assassination, the records are complete. And I think that if people look at those, they will find this is so. Is this the understanding that all the records dealing with this subject, whether they are the Inspector General reports or underlying documents, would be produced for our inspection? Yes. If I may ask only the committee's consideration of the normal treatment of the compartmentation and some discussion of possibly some individual names in it that we would hope that might be able to be handled very privately or necessary or even leave out, but the normal procedures. Church says, very well. Now, Mr. Schwartz, just to tidy up one matter, let me mark as committee exhibit number 5, the John McCone to the Director Memorandum of April 4th, 1967. The above-mentioned document was marked as Colby exhibit number 5 for identification. All right, and that's where we're going to call it for today. We will pick this up. Maybe we'll wrap it up tomorrow. I've got about 60 pages to go, so maybe not. Maybe 2 more days on this. But this is good stuff. This is really good stuff, right? It goes into the mindset of the CIA and what they really knew about the photograph. I think the most telling thing in this whole episode was the fact that they admitted the tramp photographs were tampered with. Right? So, all right, guys, I will see you tomorrow. Thank you.